All right, let's jump right into today's explainer. We're looking at a totally groundbreaking study out of Stanford University, recently highlighted by Scientas and originally published in Nature Mental Health. And honestly, it kind of changes everything we thought we knew about detecting trauma in kids. We're going to explore how the exact everyday words a child chooses to use can actually act as a highly precise early warning system for psychological distress. And as you'll see, the tech decoding all of this is pretty much shaking up the entire foundation of traditional psychology.
So think about this for a second. When we listen to someone tell a story about a stressful event, what do we usually focus on? The dramatic details, right? The climax, the tears, the action. But what if we've been listening for completely the wrong things this whole time? What if the real markers of a mind under immense pressure are actually just hiding in plain sight, tucked away in the most boring, invisible words we use every single day?
Well, the Stanford researchers found exactly that. They looked at the Dutch equivalents of these tiny connecting words and prepositions, specifically words like en, which means and, maar, meaning but, and naar, meaning to or towards. And they discovered that these little words are actually the absolute strongest predictors of whether a child will develop severe anxiety or depression later in life. It's not the big emotional vocabulary that gives away the brain's internal friction. It's actually their heavy reliance on these tiny structural joints that hold a sentence together.
And to really grasp how wild this is, look at the timeline. The researchers weren't just looking at kids who were already visibly struggling. No, they took recorded hour-and-a-half-long interviews of kids aged 9 to 13 who were just talking about stressful life events. Then, they mapped those linguistic patterns to what happened to those exact same kids a full 6 years later. By tracking this, they proved that a preteen's speech patterns can literally predict a mental health breakdown years before any actual clinical symptoms ever show up.
Okay, let's move into Section 1. The late diagnosis problem and traditional blindness.
To really appreciate how revolutionary this AI approach is, we have to look at the massive limitations of how we currently screen youth mental health. Historically, if you wanted to identify deep, chronic stress, you had to use incredibly cumbersome or expensive methods. You either needed long, time-consuming interviews with rare experts, or you had to resort to biological tests. I'm talking drawing blood to measure cortisol levels, or even checking telomere length, which are those protective caps on our chromosomes that literally shrink when we're under chronic stress. And sure, those biological markers are accurate, but they are completely impossible to scale. I mean, you can't exactly run a genetic blood panel on every single middle schooler every month, right?
Lead researcher Chase Antonacci hits the nail on the head here. Because our traditional methods just don't scale, we're basically flying blind during the most vital developmental years. By the time a human finally catches the problem during puberty, when the anxiety or depression has become super obvious, that mental distress has already deeply taken root. The psychological pathways are set in stone, making it vastly harder to treat. We absolutely need an early warning system, and biology just isn't fast or cheap enough to do the job.
Which brings us to Section 2, AI versus human experts.
Here is where things get super interesting. The researchers decided to directly compare the old, lossy human methods against algorithmic precision, and the results are pretty staggering. For this study, human experts had originally listened to those 90-minute interviews. But to process the data, those psychologists essentially squashed all that rich, complex nuance into a single, flat, arbitrary stress score. They were basically throwing away a massive amount of data. The Stanford team realized this was a huge mistake, so they fed those exact same interview transcripts into an AI. Instead of just summarizing the story, the AI meticulously analyzed the microstructures of the child's sentences, literally counting the exact frequency of every single conjunction and preposition.
And just to make sure they were being as accurate as possible and avoiding any single algorithm's bias, they didn't just use one model. They used 4 distinct, highly advanced AI language models. Think of them almost as incredibly precise, objective eavesdroppers. They aren't getting distracted by the emotion in the room. They're purely looking for the mathematical stress, hard-coded into the geometry of the speech. They're looking at the architecture of the mind, expressed through grammar.
And here is the absolute most devastating revelation from the entire paper. These 4 AI computer models were significantly better at predicting a child's future psychological breakdown than the team of experienced human experts. Just let that sink in for a second. An algorithm analyzing nothing but the text transcript of a conversation outpredicted trained psychologists who had full access to the clinical context. It fundamentally proves that human listeners, no matter how highly trained, are completely missing a hidden layer of data in human speech.
Let's explore that in Section 3, how you say it. So, what exactly is this hidden layer of data the algorithms are catching? Well, the researchers call them structural speech markers. The study proved that how a child connects their thoughts and builds their sentences is actually a way more powerful indicator of psychological distress than the terrifying events they might be describing. When a mind is under severe, chronic stress, it has to work overtime just to hold its narrative together. And that mental friction leaks out as a heavy reliance on the I form and an over-indexing of prepositions and conjunctions. It's like the brain is constantly having to build defensive verbal scaffolding just to get through a single thought.
Moving right along to Section 4, Why Content Still Matters.
Now, while the structural delivery is the most vital key here, we can't ignore the actual story being told. The words matter, but the themes matter too. There is some really important nuance in the Stanford data. When looking at the topics the kids discussed, stories involving gross physical violence obviously spiked the risk meters. But you know what was equally damaging? The theme of structural social exclusion, like a child feeling that their entire school is against them. That kind of systemic isolation severely hikes the risk of future trauma. But on the flip side, the data revealed some amazing resilience factors too. Kids who talked about sports, clubs, or support systems fared so much better. And interestingly, if a kid spontaneously mentioned a therapist or caregiver, that acted as a massive indicator of psychological resilience.
Which leads us to our final part, Section 5, the smartphone early warning.
Let's see how this all builds into an incredible, though maybe slightly daunting vision for the future of adolescent healthcare. Because the implications here go way beyond the walls of Stanford. Professor Ian Gottlieb, one of the brilliant minds behind this research, sums it up perfectly. He points out that while things like cortisol and telomere length tell us something, analyzing speech is incredibly cheap and effortlessly scalable. As he notes, it honestly seems to be a better predictor than all other traditional factors combined. We might finally have a diagnostic tool that actually matches the massive scale of the mental health crisis.
And that leads to a pretty futuristic 4-step vision. Just imagine a world where a simple smartphone app, with the parent's consent of course, occasionally records snippets of a child's speech. Then, in Step 2, an on-device AI model processes those linguistic microstructures, just quietly counting the ands, the buts, and the tos. Step 3, the system flags severe trauma risks years before they turn into a full-blown clinical crisis. And finally, Step 4, we can swoop in with early, highly targeted psychological intervention while the brain is still plastic and so much easier to heal. It literally shifts our entire healthcare paradigm from late-stage reaction to early preventative care.
Which brings us to the ultimate question. The science is totally clear. Our structural language betrays our deepest internal struggles, and AI can now read that hidden code way better than human experts ever could. So I'll leave you with this final thought for today's explainer. As this incredible AI technology scales to the everyday devices sitting right in our pockets, are we truly ready to hear what our words are secretly revealing about our minds?